Hello, I'm Shaney. I'm here to say I've dressed like an off-duty shoreman most of my life. Quince might have finally civilized me. I got their organic stretch chore coat, and I love chore coats, as you can see by every video podcast I've ever done. And suddenly, I look like an aristocratic landowner. The best part is it costs way less than it looks like it should because Quince cuts out the middleman. That's Quince, QUINCE.com/questions for free shipping and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE, quince.com/questions for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quick update from Malibu. I was trying to clear some brush before the next fire season, and I almost died. I slipped on gravel, went into a lake, blew out my shoes. Then Brunt boots showed up. I laced them up, went into full fire prep mode, and the next thing I know, I'm the guy the neighbors are asking to help. Brunt boots, built for the mess you didn't plan for. For a limited time, our listeners get $10 off Brunt by using the code SHANE, S-H-A-N-E, at checkout. Just head to bruntworkwear.com/Shane and use the code SHANE, and you're all set. After your purchase, they'll ask where you heard about them. Please tell them we sent you.
I've been reporting on things like this for a number of years. The resource curse, the economic powerhouse goes out there into the world and says, have all of this stuff, increase the standard of living, increase the health, increase the education. And then the resource curse hits and we come in and say, we're taking all your stuff.
And there's another factor, and that is that the president knows what happened to Allende of Chile, Arbenz of Guatemala, Mossadegh of Iran. He knows that heads of state that do not accept these deals are confronted with what we call the jackals, to overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. So basically, I'm saying to you, Mr. President, here, in this hand, I got a few $2 billion for you. If you decide not to take it, in this hand, I got a gun.
All right. John Perkins, author of 11 books on economics, best known, if I might be so bold, for the 2004 book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. You worked as a chief economist at a major consulting firm where you advised the World Bank, the UN, Fortune 500 companies. In 2012, you were awarded the Lennon Ono grant for a Peace Prize in nonprofit work. Lennon Ono, I'm assuming, is John Lennon, Yoko Ono?
Yes.
Very cool. Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I want to just start there and then build off that. It's fascinating.
I was an economic hitman. And we economic hitmen have created a new global economy, really, a form of capitalism that I call predatory capitalism.
I want to start in the beginning. I actually want to start with your school, but maybe let's hook them before we get back to the beginning and say, what in God's name is an economic hitman? How would you, give me the sort of the movie pitch of what an economic hitman is.
Okay, I think it's fair to say that we economic hitmen basically identify countries that have resources that our corporations covet, like oil. And we arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations, using the oil as collateral on the loan. But the money doesn't actually go to the country. It goes to our own corporations, engineering construction companies that build big infrastructure projects in that country, like electric power systems, industrial parks, ports, airports, etc.
Railways.
Yeah. Things that help the very rich who own the industries that benefit from all this.
Yeah.
But in the end, really are bad for the general population because there's money's diverted from healthcare, and other social services. So we arrange these loans. The money goes to our corporations. The projects are built. It looks good on paper because when you do these things, the GDP, the gross domestic product, increases.
Yeah.
And so for many years, I thought I was doing the right thing because business school were taught that. World Bank says that. What I didn't realize and would come to realize is that these projects benefited the very, very wealthy and for the most part extracted from the income of most everybody else. And in the end, the country can't pay its principal. And so we go back and say, hey, give us a pound of flesh. Pay, give us sell your oil to our oil companies real cheap without environmental or social regulations. Let us build a military base on your soil. Vote with us on the next United Nations vote against Cuba or China or some such thing. So it's really about empire building.
Yeah, the reason why I was fascinated by your book is exactly that. I was just in Africa, and I've been reporting on things like this for a number of years. When I was in university, I remember I studied economics, and it was a big deal, debt equity swaps, where you go in, offer loans, they can't pay back the loans, and say, no problem, we'll just take your oil until you pay back the loan, and there's so much interest and penalties, et cetera, on the loan that you take all the oil and then sell the loan to a bank at the end, and then you have a bank running the GDP of a country. What could go wrong? So fascinating stuff. Bit of a geopolitical conundrum going on, too, because America started using the economic assassins like yourself, which I'm going to get into, a bit too heavy-handedly with, let's say, having some sort of, at least some moral compunction, whereas the Chinese don't. So the Chinese are now sort of leading the charge for resources and swapping them out for infrastructure. But let's get into that. So how do you become an economic hitman? You started in business school, I believe?
Yes, when I was in business school, in my last year, I knew the next step was to be drafted and go to Vietnam. I was not interested in doing that.
Sorry, what's the year?
It was 1968.
So 68, so the draft was a big deal. If you get out of college, you're eligible for the draft. For those younger viewers out there, they used to conscript young men and send them to Vietnam, which was not fun. So we didn't want to go there.
No, and it was not just not fun, it was totally against my principles. Why I go up and kill people I don't have anything against or be killed by them,
Muhammad Ali.
Anyway, yeah, exactly. In any case, I was married at the time, and my wife's father, my father-in-law, was very high up in the Department of the Navy. His best friend was very high up in the National Security Agency. That was a potential draft deferrable job. And so he arranged for me to go through a series of extremely tough interviews, including on lie detector, for several days. And in the end, they offered me a job as a trainee.
And sorry, tough how?
Well, I was sure that I hadn't passed because under the lie detector, a couple of things I was asked, like, what do you think about the war in Vietnam? And I had to, I'm totally opposed to it. I figured that would shut me down.
Right.
And they asked if I'd ever had a run-in with police. And I'd left another college before I went to Boston University. I'd left Middlebury College. And the last night I was there, after I'd quit, I got into a fight. And a friend of mine who was Iranian pulled a knife and cut the guy who was attacking me. It was a sucker punch deal. Anyway, cut him across the face just very lightly. The next morning, I'm dragged into the police station, and I totally deny that he'd done this. I lied to the police.
Yeah.
And so I think, well, I think these people aren't going to accept me. And then, it went on and on with a lot of questions. And I also had to take mathematical tests and all kinds of tests.
So you lied about getting into a knife fight with an Iranian, and they still let you in.
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, I later find out they loved the fact that I would stand up for a buddy, and I'd lie to the police, and I got away with it. And it just so happened this Iranian friend who I lied for was the son of a general in the Shah's army in Iran, and his father worked for the CIA. So, he worked for the Shah of Iran, but he also was deeply connected with the CIA. So this was a benefit. I'd befriended and stood up to a guy who's very important to these people. So all the things I went through these tests, and they came through them, and to my surprise, they offered me a job.
I think that's Act 1 of our movie. That's fantastic. The knife fight with the Iranian, he turns out to be the son of a general. So you get scooped up by the CIA, or who was it? Who ran? It was NSA maybe?
It was the NSA that offered me the job. But shortly after that, I was walking down the corridor in Boston University, and I happened to go by a room where a Peace Corps recruiter was recruiting. I went in and I was fascinated. I've always wanted to go to the Amazon rainforest.
Right.
I grew up in New Hampshire. One of my great something grandmothers was captured by indigenous Indians there, the Abenaki, and I was fascinated with Indian lore. I was fascinated with how these people lived. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to live like that. And I knew there was one place in the world where that still happened, and that's the Amazon. So I go up to this Peace Corps recruiter and I said, hey, if I apply for the Peace Corps and ask for the Amazon, do you think I'll get it?
Yeah.
And he said, yes. He said, nobody wants to go to the Amazon.
Really?
Crazy? Yeah. But he said, yeah, I'm pretty sure you'll get it. So I called my friend, the NSA guy, who was a friend of my stepfather, my father-in-law, and I told him, and he encouraged it. He said, I'll help you get in and get to the Amazon. He said, you'll learn another language, or several languages. You'll learn great survival techniques. You'll learn how to deal with another culture. If you make it through all that, you'll be a lot more valuable to us then. And he said, but I also want to point out that you may not work directly for the NSA. You may work for a corporation that has close ties to us. So I did. For the next 3 years, I was in Ecuador, mostly in the Amazon. And when I got out, this consulting firm in Boston recruited me and offered me a job. And it turned out that the guy who I worked for, the senior vice president, was in the military also. He was reserve, high up in the reserves, and was the liaison with the NSA and the CIA.
Okay, so we're in.
Hell of a, you can't make this stuff
up.
No.
So we're into Act 2. So we go down to Ecuador. 3 years. You're learning Spanish. You're hanging out, survival skills, and then you get picked up by this company. He's a liaison between the NSA. What does this company do?
Well, it's primarily an engineering, design, and management firm. It wasn't a construction company. It engineered these projects. And one of the main jobs it had was to go into countries that had the resources that we wanted. So my first job was in Indonesia, and the United States very much wanted to bring Indonesia into its fold. So the president of Indonesia was kind of flirting with both the Soviets, the Chinese, and us. Indonesia they just discovered they had a lot of oil. It's a very strategic location, all shipping between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and that whole area has to go through Indonesia. It had the largest Muslim population in the world, and it was part of what they considered to be the dominoes. So, the Vietnam War, they said, well, if we lose Vietnam, there'll be a domino effect. Every other country in Southeast Asia will go, and Indonesia one of the first. So I'm sent off to convince the president of Indonesia to accept these huge loans, to have us build a big electrical system for them. And then we've got them in our pocket, basically. They owe us. They're going to owe us a lot of money that they're not going to be able to repay.
Hello, I'm Shaney. I'm here to say I've dressed like an off-duty shoreman most of my life, but Quince might have finally civilized me. The Italian swim trunks are the kind of trunks that say, yes, I have been banned from Capri, but no, I will not tell you about it. And the cotton modal tees are so soft, I thought I was being inducted into a cult, but a good cult. Now, the best part is it costs way less than it looks like it should, because Quince cuts out the middlemen, which I respect because I hate middlemen. Plus, every factory they use is vetted for safe, ethical practices, and you can not only look good, you can feel marvelous. Elevate your closet with Quince. Go to quince.com/questions for free shipping. That's Quince, QUINCE.com/questions for free shipping and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE, quince.com/questions for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quick update from Malibu. I was trying to clear some brush before the next fire season, and I almost died. I slipped on gravel, went into a lake, blew out my shoes, and clung onto a eucalyptus like a drunk koala. Then Brunt boots showed up, real booties. I laced them up, went into full fire prep mode, and the next thing I know, I'm the guy the neighbors are asking to help move and start up generators, which is a problem because I don't know how. No blisters, no shame, just solid footing and dignity restored. Brunt boots, built for the mess you didn't plan for. Brunt didn't just make a durable work boot, they reinvented comfort for the hardest workers out there. For a limited time, our listeners get $10 off Brunt by using the code SHANE, S-H-A-N-E, at checkout. Just head to bruntworkwear.com/Shane and use the code SHANE, and you're all set.
And they're so confident you'll love these boots that they even let you try them risk-free.
After your purchase, they'll ask where you heard about them. Please tell them we sent you.
So hold on. So you're just out of the Amazon. You're in Boston. There's a bit of culture shock. You're walking around in a park going, what the hell am I doing? And they say, okay, we're going to send you to Indonesia, and we want you to convince the president or prime minister to take $100 million infrastructure loan that we know that they can't pay back. How do they arm you to do that, or prepare you to go, a young kid to go to Indonesia to do that?
Yeah. So the story just gets better. I was in the Boston Public Library doing some research, and I couldn't find some information that I needed. And this very attractive woman comes in, sits across the table from me, hands me a book that has exactly what I'm looking for. And it's got her business card. She's special consultant, Claudine Martin, special consultant to Charles T. Main, my company. And make a long story short, she ends up being my trainer. And she tells me, you're an economist, and I very soon became chief economist, but she says, your real job is as an economic hitman. And she outlined for me what it was I was supposed to do. And I'm totally baffled by all of this, quite frankly.
And where is she from?
Don't know. She disappeared after she came back from Indonesia. This was her job. And it
But sorry, if you're a young guy and this woman just shows up in a library and says, hey, I'm training you now, I'd be like, is this 3 days of the Condor? Like, I mean, what's going on here?
Well, the other thing was during the NSA tests 3 years previously, they discovered 3 things about me that made it easy for them to hook me. And these are not that unusual for a young man, I don't think, but I wanted money, power, and sex. And I'd grown up at a boys' boarding school. My dad taught there in New Hampshire. So all my life, I'd been surrounded by all these boys, and I went to this boys' school. I was very shy around women, and I had an incredibly strong desire not to be shy, to be, I wanted this. And so, yes, it's like this dream come true. This woman comes out of nowhere, and she traced me, and she used all of those hooks to bring me in.
But did she ever say, like, by the way, I'm training you for the NSA, or I'm training you for this, or like where I come from, or any of this stuff?
She told me that what you'll be expected to do is go to these countries. Indonesia will be the first one, and you're to convince the government to take these loans. And then that your company, Charles T. Main, will also be doing these studies, which was free to Indonesia because they were financed by the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID's grants to Indonesia. But they would determine, okay, we want to invest several $billion into Indonesia. The question is, do we want to build electric power grid? Do we want to build ports or highways? What is the best thing for us and for them? So my job as an economist was to show how, if they invested in these various possibilities, how fast would the economy grow?
Yeah.
And in this case, it was quite obvious very quickly that it was going to be an integrated electrical system connecting West, Central, and East Java, which was the most populated piece of real estate in the world at the time. So my job was to have these reports, to go in and say to the president or his minister of finances, a number of other people, look, this is what you need to do. And we're going to give you a loan. The World Bank's going to give you a loan to do this. And you're going to hire one of America's companies, excellent companies, Bechtel, Halliburton, Brown and Root, to do the construction. And these reports, the president could, should take to the press, take to his people and say, look what I've done. I've created this incredible opportunity for my country.
How do you get the loans from the World Bank?
Well, the World Bank has already been part of this. They've indicated to us that they've got this amount of money that they want Indonesia to get. And
so the World Bank's already got, let's say, $2 billion. You go in and say, look, you can do, I'm an economist, you can do an electricity grid, you can do a railway, you can do 2 airports, but we looked at it in electricity to Java as your number one thing. It would be the most big bang for the buck for the electorate or whoever it is, your people, and we'll give you the money to do it. Aren't we great?
Yeah. And there's another factor.
Yeah.
And that is that the president knows if he accepts this, he and his family are going to make a lot of money because they own a lot of the industries. We're also, we tell them, we're going to make sure that your kids and all your friends' kids get into a Boston college. We get great connections with all these colleges in Boston, and we'll give them a full scholarship, expenses, and give them jobs when they get out. So that's really a bribe, but it's totally legal. In fact, we brag about it to the Boston Globe. We gave so many millions of dollars to this country in scholarships. It sounds good, but it was really a bribe.
Yeah.
So all these perks that we can offer the president and his friends.
Yeah.
And at the same time, he knows what happened to Allende of Chile, Arbenz of Guatemala, Mossadegh of Iran. He knows that heads of state that do not accept these deals, and our little subtle reminder, are confronted with what we call the jackals, people that overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. So basically, I'm saying to you, Mr. President, here, in this hand, I got $2 billion for you. It's going to help you and your family. If you decide not to take it, in this hand, I got a gun.
Right.
I never carried a gun, but they knew that behind me were people who make life very difficult.
The jackals would come. Well, why would you say no then? So you go to Indonesia. Was it successful, A? And B, what happens when you get back?
Yeah, it was very successful. I was there on that particular trip for 3 months, and later I'd make frequent trips.
And who is the prime minister at the time or the president?
We'd gone from Sukarno to Suharto.
Suharto, yeah.
So, and there'd been this revolution in the meantime. The country was really in turmoil.
Yeah.
So it was an important time for us to go. I mean, the country was very vulnerable, and the Chinese and the Soviet Union were all trying to get into the country.
Year of living dangerously.
That's it. That describes some of it. Yes, some of it.
Yeah, it's a great movie. I think it's one of Mel Gibson's first movies, but it's a great movie about the upheaval in Indonesia at that time. So you're successful. They take the money. You start building the grid. You come home. You're now a successful spy. How does your life change? What do you do from then? So now we're in the middle of Act 2. How do we finish out Act 2 here before we get to the smash bang finish of Act 3?
Well, yeah, they hadn't started building the grid, but that's the next step is to design it and the whole process that goes into there. Money was allocated. Let's put it that way, and I was very successful, and my bosses were very impressed. And at that time, also, the World Bank was tightening up more and more on making sure that all these studies that were done to determine where the money would go was done by economists, because in the past they'd often been done by engineers at these engineering companies. So now the World Bank is really putting the pressure on to get legitimate studies done. So I'm suggested that I hire more people, that I become the chief economist, and that we start spreading out and getting people to go to more and more countries. So it was very successful, and that's what we did. And I ended up very soon after that going to Iran and Panama and Colombia and doing
similar. Hold on. What happened in Iran and what happened in Panama?
two very different situations. Because Iran, you didn't need to convince Iran to take a loan. They had lots of money.
Yeah.
So the idea was to convince the Shah, who
Yeah.
I worked directly with,
Wow.
and a little bit. There were usually people in between, but
Sure.
To convince Iran that they should use this money that they were making off their oil to hire American companies again to modernize Iran, which at the time was, kind of a medieval country. Tehran itself, which became an amazing city, was, it was just developing, but there was these other whole areas of the country that needed electricity, they needed water and sewage systems, they needed tremendous opportunities for American engineering companies and technology companies like General Electric and others to make a lot of money by doing the projects there. So the idea was to convince Iran. Now, in the case of Panama was pivotal because at the time, Omar Torrijos, the head of state, was negotiating a canal treaty with Jimmy Carter, it was working up to that, to get the canal back to Panama. And at the same time, Torrijos was very bold and very charismatic. He and I became friends. He loved to party. He invited me to a lot of parties, barbecues. In fact, and ultimately, a number of years later, he was the one who convinced me to get out of being an economic hitman. He was looked at as a real hero all over the world.
Because he brought back the canal.
Well, yes, and he stood up to Goliath. He was a David who stood up to Goliath in a little country, relatively insignificant other than the canal, and he stood up to the United States. And so, my job was to convince him not to go forward with this.
Right.
And it didn't work. He wouldn't hear of it. He had a lot of integrity, and as you may know, he died in a very suspicious plane crash.
Yeah. Okay. Now, what about Africa? Were there any trips to Africa, or did you send anyone there?
We had people in Africa, but I wasn't one of them, except Northern Africa. I did some work in Egypt.
Right.
I never worked in sub-Saharan Africa. It was certainly going on there, but that wasn't part of me. I was really after besides Indonesia and in the Middle East, where everybody was, we had Iran and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. I was really focused on Latin America because I spoke Spanish. I knew the culture.
Right.
I knew how to go in there.
So Indonesia first gig, then the Middle East, then concentrating in South America or Central America. Very interesting. Now, to start our third act, why in God's name did you stop, and how do you stop? I mean, isn't it kind of like once you're in, you're in?
Yeah. In fact, Claudine, my trainer, had told me that, if you just go forward with this, you're in for life. Actually, I found that very exciting. I knew I was going to make a lot of money. I came from this poor teacher's family, and so on. I was flying first class around the world. It was very, very attractive. Plus, it was something very James Bondish about the whole thing.
For sure.
Once you're in for life.
You're a kid from New Hampshire public school, meaning private school, in the British sense, public school, sort of sheltered away, all of a sudden first class, you're in Iran, you're in, Panama, you're in, Indonesia, things are happening. You're in the big game, billions of dollars, World Bank. I mean, come on. That's the reason why I keep going first, second, third act is it's a movie script.
Yeah. Well.
And the company you're working for, does it publicly have ties with the American government, and it's funded by the American government? How does that work?
Well, it was a private company. It was a closely held corporation, basically a partnership, and I became one of the partners.
Wow.
We had about 2,000. I became the youngest partner in its 100-year history. We had about 2,000 professional employees working for us, mainly engineers, and then my department, which was up to about 50 people in economics. And incidentally, the company eventually got sold to Shaw Industries, and the name went away. You can find information on Shaw Steam name, but it's no longer operating that way.
Right.
At the time, it was a very secretive company. We weren't supposed to talk to the press, and except if we were talking about scholarships.
Right.
to other countries, a few things like that, but very influential. And I never worked for the CIA or the NSA directly. My salary always came from Charles T. Main. Charles T. Main had contracts to do these projects with the U.S. Treasury Department, the State Department, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, organizations like that. So we would have contracts. The company would have contracts,
Right.
and then I was paid by the company.
So if we look it up, we would find all kinds of contracts for Charles T. Main Company and the American government.
Yeah, if you can go deep enough. Once everything went digital, a lot of those old paper files got kind of lost, which I find very, very interesting.
Yeah.
I've gone to raw engineering and asked them for some specific details, and they tell me that those were paper files, and they weren't important enough that we didn't ever digitalize them because you
Right.
have to put and choose. So they went from paper to microfiche, if you remember
Yeah,
microfiche,
sure.
and then that never translated well into the digital age. So it's quite interesting to me how much stuff is lost up there.
Yeah.
The New York Times did a major story on me back in 2006, I think, and they vetted me, and they wanted, but they had a hard time. They wanted to see all my old passports, which fortunately I'd kept,
Right.
which showed I was in these countries at the time that these things happened, and then they talked to other people who'd been there. But it's interesting how things disappear, especially during that transition from paper to digital.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. Like whenever you tell a crazy story, and I'm familiar, I tell something, they're like, "Come on!" And the good news with me is a lot of it was filmed, so you can just say, "Yep, well, there it is, me and General Butt Naked, or me and the head of the Taliban, or whatever," and it's on film. Because people don't want to believe you. They don't want to think, wow, this guy's the real life James Bond. But you just answered my question perfectly, which is, look, the New York Times did a big piece on me and send in the paperwork and the passports and everything. So because a lot of this goes online and people are like, well, this can't be true.
Let me share a quick story with you that goes back to Iranian with the knife. So this New York Times reporter hangs out with me for a number of days. He actually, I'm on a speaking tour for my publisher. He's going with me, and I think he came to trust me. And then he's writing this article. So several months into this process, he calls me and he says, "John, I got to ask you." He says, "You said that you married a woman named Anne from Middlebury College, and the alumni department doesn't show any Anne in your class.
Right.
You also talk about this Iranian. There were no Iranians in your class." And I said, "Well, I don't know what to say because there was an Iranian and there were a couple of Anns, so
Yeah.
I say." But he said, "Well, can you give me their true last names?" Because I used pseudonyms for them. So after discussing this and him assuring me that he would never pass it on, I was particularly worried about the Iranian because now he worked for the CIA. But I gave him the names. So a few hours later, he calls me back and he says, "My God," he says, "I went to a friend at Middlebury who works for the library, and she went back and she found this little book in the summer before you went to your freshman year, they gave you this little book called Profiles
Yeah.
that had all of our pictures and a little bit about us." And he said, "Yes, that Iranian is in the book. And so is the Anne that you ended up marrying. They're both in the book, the freshman book." So I called the alumni department back, the New York Times guy says, and I pointed this out to him. And he said, "Oh, yeah." Well, he said, and he goes through his files and he said, "Well, yeah, that Anne never gave any money to the school, so we dropped her from our files." And the Iranian guy was kicked out for getting in a knife fight. He was expelled.
The Iranian did give us money, so we deleted his files too. Fantastic story. So we're getting into Act 3 of this incredible movie. So we start off in college. We have a very strange movie-esque meeting with a woman in a library who becomes your trainer. Then you become successful. You're making money. Your business is making money. It's a conduit for World Bank funds, American funds, NSA funds, all kinds of funds. Why stop?
About 7 years in, I'm with Omar Torrijos.
The president of Panama.
Yeah. And he's saying, John, don't you realize that you're selling a lie and you're lying to yourself? You look at, you do these studies and it shows this gross domestic product grows, which it does. But what you don't understand is gross domestic product only measures how well the very wealthy are doing and the commercial establishments. It doesn't record my people, the fishermen, farmers. These people just aren't really included, and when they are included, it's very minor. So he says, you're hurting those people. You're not helping them. And then it was kind of funny. One afternoon, we're out on this yacht that belonged to a friend of his, and when we're sitting there on this yacht, he's got a bunch of his staff around. We're all drinking these boat drinks, whatever it is, whatever. And there's a lot of very attractive young women and teenies and sitting around us. And Omar looks at me and he says, "Hey, John, why don't you come to work for me? You won't make nearly as much money, but you'll feel good about yourself." And then he spreads his arm around this boat and he says, "And you'll have a lot more fun."
Classic.
I didn't go to work for him, but it got my, I got to thinking about, well, yeah. And then I talked to other people. I had the time I was dating or having a lover who was in Colombia, and she was very attuned to what was going on. Her brother was a member of what became FARC, the terrorist organization.
Sure.
So she's telling me the same thing. Like, don't you understand what you're really doing here in Colombia? Yeah. And so my conscience is getting to me, and I'm getting it. And I'll say this, my family goes back to 1600s in New England, very Yankee Calvinist, with a lot of integrity. My dad always said, "I don't need to make a lot of money. I love teaching. I love helping young people." So
I just will point out, that's a great movie scene of the president of Panama, principal guy, convincing you not to be a spy while he's sitting on a boat with a bunch of babes, which is classic. I'm going to turn you over to my side of working things. It's impressive that actually took hold, because I always find in real life is not like the movies. In real life, you say, "Yeah, no, I'm going to take the money, John. I'm going to take the money, General. I'm going to take the money, Mr. President," because when you stop living that life, the girls in Colombia stop, the first class tickets stop, the unlimited cash, the perks all stop, and humans don't like to go backwards in my experience. So you start getting a crisis of conscience. But what really made you act on that?
Well, I tried. I was in denial, like you say, for a long time. For the next 3 years, I'm trying to convince myself that that's not right. And I actually go in at one point. I decide I'm going to quit. I go in and talk to human relations, HR, the head there, and he tells me, "Oh, of course we're doing the right thing. And look, you're making a lot of money." And yeah, I was living the American dream, I thought. But I also began to understand that as I'm flying off to these places and having all these meetings and dealing with a lot of jet lag, I'm kind of living on alcohol and Valium.
As do we all.
Yeah. I don't anymore.
No. I got it. So stress, you're flying around, you're tired, you're burnt out.
I realized I wasn't happy. Maybe I'm living the American dream, but it's not. I'm really not very happy with this. But it's still, it was really hard. Plus, I'm getting a lot of pressure not to get out.
Yeah.
And then finally, after about 3 years of going through this turmoil, I take a vacation in the Caribbean. I rented a small sailboat. I've been a sailor for a long time. And I anchored off St. John Island in the Virgin Islands. And I rowed the boat, like dinghy ashore, late one afternoon, and climbed this hill up to an old sugar plantation, the ruins of an old sugar plantation. It's beautiful. It's covered with bougainvillea. I'm sitting there. I've got a 6-pack of beer. I'm sitting there looking out at the sun setting over the Caribbean, and I'm thinking, ain't life grand? This is ideal. And then it strikes me that this plantation was built on the bones of thousands of slaves. And then I'm realizing, well, wait, this whole continent is built on the bones of millions of slaves, not just from Africa, but local indigenous people also. And then I had to admit that I too was a slaver.
Right.
I wasn't putting people in physical chains, but I'm enslaving them with debt.
Economic.
At that time, I got really pissed off at myself. I was furious. I had a big stick. I hit it. I was so mad at myself. And this is, 3 years into having gone through soul searching and yet constantly putting it off. And at that point, I made a decision that I wouldn't continue. And I went back to Boston at the end of the vacation and quit.
That is a perfect segue. See, that's a very cinematographic with hitting the stick and smashing and saying, no, we're all bad people. So that's good because you've learned your lesson. Now we get into Act 3. But before we do that, I want to get into, so we're giving people loans. It's in cahoots with the World Bank, which is being funded by the American government. Fine. We didn't get into the bad stuff. So, you can't pay back your loan. No problem. We've got a plan for that. So maybe get into a bit of, and I'm sure that had something to do with your existential crisis of seeing the results of your quote unquote great work of getting these massive loans for infrastructure for these countries. And then when they can't pay it back, which everybody knew, I'm sure you did as an economist, then what were the ramifications?
Well, I'd like to say that we then went back in the guise of the IMF. So the IMF is sort of the policing agency around all this stuff.
International Monetary Fund.
Right. And that wasn't usually me. I'd been the guy that arranged the loan. So it was usually somebody else, although sometimes I would be somewhat involved in it. But
you were the salesman, not the loan shark.
Exactly. No, I wasn't the guy that carried the baseball bat and broke the knees, basically. But those guys would go in and they'd say, hey, you can't pay your debt, but we'll help you restructure your loan. But the trade-off here is you got to make certain conditions. You've got to do certain things in your government. You've got to privatize some of your public utilities, your water and sewage system, et cetera. Sell it to our investors at cheap prices because they can do a lot better job than you can do. You've got to vote with us, like I said earlier, in the next friend vote that we want, and allow us. We'd like to put a military base here on your soil,
and we want to pump your oil and have first rights.
That was the first thing. The first thing, obviously, is we go for the collateral. It's in the contract actually. The oil, or today it tends to be gold, cobalt, lithium, copper, things that are needed for the high-tech industry.
Right.
But that's in the contract. If you can't pay your loan, we get some of that.
Yeah.
So it was there. But in addition, there's these other conditionalities that that really are extremely colonialistic.
Which leads you to your existential slavery wailing at the plantation moment, which is great. I love it. Now, what do you see? So you have a history of this. You know the inside sort of baseball, if you will. What do you see today? So you were mentioning it just now, so that'll be our springboard into what economic chains are being put out there today for cobalt, rare earth minerals, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, the Confessions of an Economic Hitman turned out to be a trilogy.
Right.
And the third edition came out a little over a year ago. It's about China's economic hitman. In fact, interestingly, I just got the copy of the cover.
Plug it. There we go. Oh, I like the cover. What does it say?
It says Confessions of an Economic Hitman, third edition.
In Chinese?
Yes.
But is it going to be released in China?
It has been released in China.
Wow, congratulations.
I should have it here with me. I just this morning received the books themselves. They're up in the other room.
Wow, congratulations.
Well, it's shocking because I criticize China a lot.
Yeah.
And the first two parts of the trilogy, which don't talk about China, were published by the same publisher, Big House in China. Publisher and I here in the United States, when we did the third edition, we said that China will never publish this.
Yeah.
And we were shocked when they bought the rights.
Why? Why did they? It seems crazy.
Well, I think that I have to say that I think, and I taught an MBA program in China, and I found that the students there knew a lot. A lot of them had been to school in Europe or the United States. China does not, in my opinion, this business of restricted rights as to what you read and see isn't what we in the United States want to believe it is.
Right.
Yes, they have a lot more regulations on social media, et cetera, than we do. But there's also a lot of accessible information. And this book being published there really shakes up that whole theory because it's
And
quite critical.
they probably like it too because it shows that the Americans went out there and this was accepted foreign policy that the Chinese then sort of just slid in behind them.
Yeah, and it also tells the truth that in the year 2000, the United States was the number one trading partner with about 80% of the world's countries. That reversed itself. Today, it's China.
Yeah.
I have another map here, so you can see that this is several years old.
Yeah.
But China, this is in I can't see the year on this. It was 3 years old, and China is the largest trading partner of the 124 countries versus America's 56. Mind you, in 2000, we were 80% of the world.
Yeah.
China has taken over. Their economic hitmen have been much more effective than we ever were. They learned from our mistakes and our successes, and they've got an incredible story to present in Africa,
Yeah.
Latin America, parts of Asia, and the Middle East, and Europe.
Yeah, they've done a fantastic job at being economic hitmen. I was just in Africa, and you can see it everywhere. You know, they'll come in and they'll build railways, they'll build stadiums for the big soccer, matches. They'll build you whatever you want, and it's pretty amazing because they bring in, Chinese workers, and so that they build, little villages that are sort of Chinese, and they bring in their own banking systems, and they bring in their own stuff, and it's all this self-contained thing. And then they have basically the middle class who end up staying there to run it are Chinese, and everybody's paying back to it's like the mafia. I mean, they're all paying back to the Don in mainland China, and they can never pay these incredibly expensive bills back. So they're like, fine, we need all these, and they've already, like you said, they've already exactly what minerals and where. Oh, you've got uranium, you've got lithium, you've got rare. We need all of this stuff. So we'll just, by the way, we'll mine it for you as well. We'll do it all. We're a one-stop shop. And I'm like, okay. And then the money goes. I love that map, by the way, that shows, because you can really see it in Africa. It used to be America, lots of nefarious, and like you said, army bases, and you would have sweaty Americans in tan suits, drinking rum, at 2 p.m. And now it's just a Chinese village, just sort of decked out in low rent, Temu Chinese outfits, in any African downtown. It's crazy.
Yeah. Little white and blue buildings that they, at least in Latin America, they build them all over for their workers. It's villages. Yeah, I mean, they've just been incredibly effective, and frankly, they've got a really good story to sell.
Yeah.
They go in and they say, hey, we averaged about 10% economic growth for 30 years.
Yeah.
No one else has done anything like that ever. And we brought 900 plus million people out of dire poverty. That's twice the population of the United States. And so, if you go to the president of one of these other countries and you tell that story, it's pretty damned attractive.
It's pretty damned attractive if you say also we don't have a press that comes out and says any bad things about you, the leader.
True. And also, we will not try to dictate to you any of your policies. They say this. That's not exactly true. But they say a lot of things that are just part of the truth, But I'll tell you what, it's a great story. And, the first time I really ran into this, I thought, damn, well, why didn't we think of that?
We could have been better at economically enslaving the world. Which, by the way, look, we condemn China. They learned it from us. The economic powerhouse goes out there into the world and says, have all of this stuff, increase the standard of living, increase the health, increase the education, all a great pitch. And then As you well know, the resource curse hits, and we come in and say, we're taking all your stuff. We're either taking it by hook or we're taking it by crook, but we're taking it. And, now there's a big war between America and the West and China and its allies to grab all this stuff. So I'm going to leave on that. Where do you see this going? Where do you see the future of economic assassination going?
I think what we need to realize is that the system that we built and China's now building is what a lot of economists are calling a death economy.
Right.
It's an economic system that's built on maximizing short-term profits and materialistic consumption on part of everyone. And it's really taking us towards self-destruction. We're polluting and consuming ourselves into a very dangerous situation, as I think we all know.
Yes.
And here you get China and the United States that represent almost 50% of the world's GDP and almost 50% of the world's pollution. If these two countries can disagree on all kinds of other things, but if we can't somehow come to terms that we've got to turn this into a life economy, which is an economic system that's built on the goal of maximizing long-term benefits for all life.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, make short-term profits, but you don't have to maximize them. You can put some of these profits toward making better conditions for your workers, paying them better salaries, health insurance, retirement funds, and developing new technologies that do not no longer ravage the earth, that recycle, that create cyclical economies, that regenerate ravaged environments, that come up with technologies that we haven't even explored yet. How do we create energy out of the air, out of the water? So on and so forth. There's a tremendous opportunity here for us to develop a new type of economic system that will, in fact, do what needs to be done for my grandson and all of his brothers and sisters around the world to have a decent life. I think we're at a cusp where these days I travel around a lot. I just came back from Qatar. I've been recently in Europe and Latin America, and I go back to Latin America in a couple of weeks. And everywhere I go, I hear people that are talking about these same things, and people are really becoming cognizant of melting glaciers and rising oceans and so on and so forth. So at the same time, there's pushback by the status quo. And throughout history, we've seen this. Whenever there's let's call this a consciousness revolution. Whenever there's a revolution, the status quo pushes back. They try to stop it. And good revolutionaries or agents of change, whatever we want to call ourselves, will take that as encouragement. They're pushing back because they know they're losing. So we need to take energy from this. I've been a martial artist most of my life, and I know if I'm up against a guy who's bigger and stronger than me, I don't try to overpower him. I got to use his energy against him. And I think we're in that situation now where we are understanding that we're living in a tremendous crisis. There's no denying it. And this death economy is the problem. So climate change, all these wars, income inequality, species extinction, environmental destruction, those are all problems, but they're not the problem. What's causing all of those is this socioeconomic system that we have that glorifies short-term maximization of material consumption and profits. And we really must move beyond that. And I think, I taught at an MBA program in China a few years back, and I could see these young Chinese students are really concerned about the future. They've lived through horrible pollution.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want for their families. Perhaps they're much more educated about this than we in the United States are, because we haven't had the kinds of problems that they've had. Unfortunately, I mean, they've created an economic miracle, but it's come at a big price environmentally and socially.
Yeah.
They don't want to continue. They told me, we want to create the next miracle will be to create a better world. And I don't know whether they do it or not, but I know they were sincere.
I'm going to say three things: that I spent a month in Beijing and never saw the sun once. Not great. And two other things. One is congratulations, because most people on a boat with beautiful women and boat drinks would not say I'm going to change my life and then go through with it. They'd say I'm going to change my life and do more of this. But I agree with you 100%. Look, and I also agree we should choose the life economy over the death economy. I think we are not only on a cusp, we're at a crossroads, and we can either choose that and say, look, if we don't make some changes soon, there will be all of these terrible things happening with sea level rise and climate change, and we're seeing already things happen, and it's just the beginning, and it's bad. When climate migration of hundreds of millions of people happen, we can just imagine the chaos. But I think, contrary what I see happening, contrary to young people, maybe young people are waking up. What I see is we're going headlong into a overt Cold War with China as they become number one, and we fall noisily into becoming number two. Humans don't like to go backwards, and America does not want to become number two. But mathematically, that's where we're heading. Listen. Let's keep this open. John Perkins, this was amazing. Do you have any final thoughts before we close?
Yeah,
There we go. Go.
I'd like to comment on what you just said.
Sure, yeah.
The probability is against us, but history is written by those who defy probability. All the events in history have defied probability, or most all of them.
Well, history's written by the victors, so whoever wins this war is going to write the history, and I think it's going to be covered just like your new book. That's what it's going to look like.
So my final words are: I think your listeners ought to feel blessed to be alive at this time. Frankly, I do, because we are at this cusp. It's an incredibly exciting time. We are evolving. Now we've got AI coming along.
Yeah.
Huge challenges, huge possibilities.
Yeah.
So your listeners should, just buy into this, be part of it, become part of it, open up to it and figure out what is it you personally are going to do that will bring you great satisfaction and also create a better world for future generations.
All right. And on that note, John Perkins, thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.